"Ma'am, we're closing in 15 minutes." The voice, belonging to a groundskeeper leaning on a rake, was gentle but firm. Caroline Sterling registered it as a distant hum, a minor inconvenience in the tightly scheduled symphony of her life. She gave a curt, dismissive nod, her gaze fixed on the simple granite headstone. Sarah Sterling, beloved sister, devoted mother. The words felt like a lie. Not the sister or mother part, but the word beloved. It implied a warmth, a universal affection that Caroline knew her sister had been denied, most pointedly by their own father, and by extension by Caroline herself, who had stood by and let it happen. The triplets, her charges, her legacy, her burden, stood in a silent, solemn line beside her. 8 years old, yet they carried the gravity of old men. Noah, his small fists clenched at his sides, stared at the engraved name as if trying to stare it back into existence. Mia, her brow furrowed, was tracing the letters in the air with a single finger, her mind likely cataloging the font, the kerning, the cold finality of the stone. And Leo was gone. Caroline's head snapped around, a spike of pure, cold panic lancing through her. The cemetery was vast, dotted with ancient oaks and weeping willows. He could be anywhere. "Leo?" she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. Noah pointed. "Over there." Her eyes followed his finger to a figure kneeling by Sarah's grave, a man she hadn't noticed before. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in worn jeans and a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across a powerful back. His head was bowed, and he was carefully, methodically arranging a small, wild-looking bouquet at the base of the headstone. Not roses or lilies from a florist, but a vibrant, unruly clutch of Queen Anne's lace, black-eyed Susans, and purple clover, wildflowers, the kind Sarah used to press between the pages of her books. And kneeling beside the man, watching his large, capable hands with rapt attention, was Leo. Her silent, sensitive, flight risk of a nephew was utterly captivated. The man hadn't seemed to notice the boy's approach. He finished arranging the flowers, then gently brushed a stray leaf from the granite. He spoke, his voice a low, rumbling murmur, too soft for Caroline to hear the words, but the tone was one of intimate conversation. Caroline started forward, 100 sharp rebukes forming on her tongue. "Who are you? Get away from my nephew. Don't touch that grave." But she stopped as the man finally looked up and saw Leo. There was no surprise in his eyes, no alarm, just a soft, tired recognition. He gave Leo a small, sad smile that seemed to transform his rugged face, carving lines of profound grief and something else, something like wonder. Leo, who hadn't willingly touched a stranger since the funeral, reached out a small hand and placed it on the man's forearm. The man's breath hitched. He slowly, reverently, covered Leo's small hand with his own. For a moment they just stayed like that, a tableau of silent communication that felt ancient and sacred. Mia and Noah, sensing the shift, drifted over, their own curiosity overriding their practiced solemnity. "Who are you?" Mia asked, her voice clear and direct, devoid of social niceties. The man's gaze lifted from Leo and swept over Mia, then Noah. It lingered on each of them, a look of such raw, undisguised hunger that it made Caroline's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't predatory. It was the look of a starving man seeing a feast. "I'm a friend of your mother's," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was struggling to contain. "Did you bring those?" Noah asked, pointing a thumb at the wildflowers. The man nodded. "She loved them." "How do you know?" Mia pressed. "We grew them," he said simply. Caroline finally found her voice, striding the last few feet to stand protectively behind the children. "That's enough," she said, her tone clipped and cold. "Children, come here." The man flinched as if she'd struck him. He slowly pulled his hand away from Leo's, and the loss of contact seemed to physically pain him. He rose to his feet, and Caroline found herself looking up. He was tall, solid as one of the ancient oaks, with eyes the color of dark, rich soil. They were filled with an agony so deep it felt like a physical presence. He looked at her, and for a second, she felt seen in a way that was deeply unsettling, as if he could see past the CEO, past the tailored suit, and into the broken places she kept so carefully hidden. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raspy. "I didn't mean to intrude." "This is a private space," Caroline stated, pulling Mia and Noah closer. Leo remained stubbornly in place, his eyes still fixed on the man. "I know," the man whispered. He took one last, lingering look at the triplets, his gaze a physical touch, a caress, a farewell. Then he turned without another word and walked away. His shoulders slumped, his entire being radiating a sense of profound and permanent loss. He didn't look back. Leo watched him go, then looked down at the wildflowers, then up at Caroline. He opened his mouth, a rare occurrence, and spoke a single, devastating word. "Daddy." The drive back to the city was a silent, suffocating affair. Leo's question hung in the chilled air of the Bentley, an accusation Caroline couldn't answer, couldn't dismiss. She had glanced at the other two in the rearview mirror. Mia was staring out the window, processing, her small gears turning at a furious pace. Noah was glaring at the back of Caroline's headrest, his default state of anger now focused and intensified. When they arrived at the penthouse, the silence was replaced by a different kind of emptiness. The vast, minimalist space, all glass and steel and shades of white, was designed for cocktail parties, not for children. It was a showroom for a life, not a home. The triplets dispersed to their designated corners of the enormous living room. Mia pulled a thick book on astrophysics from a shelf. Noah grabbed a tablet and immediately dove into a loud, explosive game, and Leo went to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass, a small, lonely silhouette against the sprawling, indifferent city. Their grief was a living thing in the apartment, a fourth child she didn't know how to parent. She had given them the best of everything, the best schools, the best clothes, the best therapists, but their sadness remained, a stubborn, unyielding presence. She managed a multi-billion-dollar global corporation, negotiated with heads of state, shaped markets with a single decision. But she could not manage the three small, broken hearts in her care. Her sister, Sarah, had been the opposite. She had managed nothing but a small garden and a torrent of emotions, all of them worn on her sleeve. She was messy, impractical, and, according to their father, a profound disappointment. But she had known how to love these children. Caroline could see it in the way they still looked for her in every room, the way they fell silent when a stranger had her laugh, the way they clung to the few worn storybooks that had survived the purging of Sarah's unsophisticated belongings. Caroline retreated to her home office, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city, but no escape from her thoughts. She sat at her expansive desk, the surface clean save for a single, sleek monitor. With a few sharp clicks, she brought up the feed from the private investigator she kept on a perpetual retainer. "I need a name," she said, her voice flat. "Man at Oakwood Cemetery today, around 4 p.m. Sarah Sterling's plot. Tall, dark hair, late 30s. Driving a beat-up Ford truck, license plate." She rattled off the number she had committed to memory. "I want to know everything." As she waited, she stared at her own reflection in the dark screen. The severe lines of her suit, the tightly controlled chignon, the mask of cool competence. It was the face of a winner. The face her father had cultivated. The face that had cost her a relationship with her sister. Her father, Arthur Sterling, had despised Sarah's choice of partner. A man he deemed a penniless, ambitionless nobody. Carpenter. When Sarah got pregnant, Arthur had issued an ultimatum. The family or the man. Sarah, terrified and alone, had chosen the illusion of security. The man had disappeared. Sarah had withered. A file popped up on Caroline's screen. Jacob Vance. Carpenter. Her blood ran cold. She clicked open the file. A smattering of public records. A business license for Vance Woodcrafting, a mortgage on a small, unassuming house in a working-class suburb, and a death certificate for his wife, dated a year after the triplets were born. He'd married someone else, had another family. The thought brought a strange, bitter relief, followed by an immediate wave of shame. Then she scrolled down and saw the attached notes from the PI. Subject has no other known children. Wife died in a car accident. Subject appears to be a one-man operation. Small custom jobs. Neighbors describe him as quiet, private, keeps to himself. He hadn't replaced Sarah. He hadn't moved on. He had simply endured. Caroline leaned back, the leather of her chair groaning in the silent room. That look in his eyes, the hunger, the grief, it wasn't for a friend. It was for a ghost, for a life he was never allowed to live. And those children, his children. The man from the cemetery wasn't just a ghost from Sarah's past. He was a father, their father, and he was alive. This was not a problem money could solve. This was a complication that threatened to unravel the meticulously ordered, brutally simple world she had built. A world where she was in control. A world where she could protect the children by keeping them inside the glass walls of the Sterling legacy. But for the first time, looking out at the city lights, she was forced to wonder if she was protecting them or imprisoning them. The scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pine filled Jacob's lungs, a familiar balm that usually soothed the frayed edges of his soul. But not tonight. Tonight, the scent was laced with the ghost of Sarah's perfume and the impossible, vibrant reality of 3 small faces. He ran a hand over the half-finished surface of a rocking chair, the grain of the white oak smooth and true beneath his calloused palm. He'd been working on it for weeks, a commission for a family expecting their first child. He usually loved this part of the process, the patient shaping of raw material into something that would hold and comfort a new life. But tonight, every stroke of the sandpaper, every tap of the mallet felt like a lie. He was building a cradle for a stranger's child, while his own were being raised by a woman who looked at him like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. Seeing them, it was like a physical blow. He had honored his promise to Sarah, the hardest promise he'd ever made. "He'll ruin you, Jacob," she'd sobbed, her hands clutching his shirt, her belly swollen with the lives they'd made together. "My father, he'll destroy you. He'll make sure you never work again. He'll bleed you dry in the courts. We'll have nothing. Please, just for a little while. Let me handle him. I'll make him see. Once they're born, he'll see. Just give me time. Disappear for a while. Please, Jacob. For them." And he had. He had vanished, becoming a ghost in his own life, trusting in the fierce, desperate love she had for their children. He moved to a different city, took whatever work he could find, and waited for her call. The call never came. Instead, a sterile, white envelope arrived one day, containing a newspaper clipping of her obituary and a cashier's check for a sum so large it felt like an insult. Payment for his silence. From Arthur Sterling. He'd torn the check to pieces, but the message was clear. Sarah was gone. The door was closed forever. He had tried to move on. He'd met another woman, a kind, gentle soul who understood the geography of grief. They had built a quiet life, a fragile peace. And then he'd lost her, too, in a senseless, random crash of steel and glass. He was left with nothing but his work and the hollow ache of a life unlived. But today, at the cemetery, standing over the grave he visited every week, the hollow ache had been filled with a sudden, shocking, agonizing hope. Leo, Mia, Noah. He had known them instantly. Leo had Sarah's eyes, that same old-soul stillness. Mia had her fierce intelligence, the way she tilted her head when she was dissecting the world. And Noah had his own stubborn jawline, the protective fire he felt every time he looked at Sarah. They were hers, they were his, and they were beautiful. The way Leo had looked at him, the way the boy had reached out and anchored himself to him, it had rearranged his atoms. For 8 years he had been a phantom limb, a missing piece of their lives. But in that one moment he had been real. He had been seen. And then she had appeared. Caroline Sterling, Sarah's older sister, all sharp angles and cold fury, a fortress in a designer suit. She looked at him with the same disdain her father had, the same chilling assessment of his worth. She had snatched the children away as if he were a contagion. He walked over to a dusty, forgotten corner of his workshop and pulled a tarp off a large, shapeless form. Beneath it was a collection of half-finished projects, things he'd started for them in the early days, before the hope had curdled into resignation. A child-sized table with 3 small chairs, a bookshelf carved to look like a tree, and a beautiful, intricate rocking horse, its head thrown back, its mane a cascade of sculpted wood, waiting for a rider who never came. He ran a hand down its flank, the wood cool and smooth. He had failed them. He had kept his promise to their mother, but in doing so, he had abandoned his children to a world of cold glass and sterile wealth, a world without wildflowers. He had let Arthur Sterling win. He didn't know what he was going to do. He had no rights, no power, no army of lawyers. All he had were his 2 hands and a heart that was, at this very moment, breaking all over again. But as he stood there in the quiet hum of his workshop, the ghost of a small hand on his arm, he knew one thing for certain. He was done being a ghost. Caroline's office at Sterling Enterprises was on the 80th floor, a glass-walled cage that offered a god's-eye view of the city. It was a space designed to intimidate, to reinforce the chasm between her and the rest of the world. Jacob Vance did not look intimidated. He stood in the center of the room, his worn work boots planted firmly on the hand-woven Tibetan silk rug, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He looked less like a supplicant and more like a man assessing the structural integrity of the building. "Thank you for coming," Caroline said, her voice a cool, polished instrument. She gestured to one of the severe leather chairs opposite her desk. He ignored it, his gaze sweeping over the opulent, impersonal space. "You have my file," he said. "It wasn't a question. You know who I am." "I know what my investigator could find," she corrected. "I want to hear it from you. Why were you at my sister's grave?" His dark eyes finally settled on her, and the raw grief in them was so potent she had to fight the urge to look away. "Your sister," he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "She was my Sarah, the mother of my children. I go every week. I've gone every week for 7 years. The question isn't why I was there, Ms. Sterling. It's where you've all been." The accusation struck home, sharp and true. She hadn't been to the grave in over a year. It was an item on a calendar, an obligation she often delegated. "They are my children now," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "I am their legal guardian." A bitter, humorless smile touched his lips. "A piece of paper, signed by a judge who never saw the way Sarah looked at me. A piece of paper that your father paid for." "You don't know anything about my father." "I know everything I need to know," Jacob countered, his voice dropping lower, each word landing like a hammer blow. "I know he saw me as dirt on his shoe. I know he threatened to ruin me, to use his army of lawyers to paint me as an unfit father, to ensure that if I fought for them, my children would be born into a war zone of poverty and legal battles. I know he forced the woman I loved to choose between me and a roof over her children's heads. And I know she made that choice because she loved them and she was terrified. She asked me to disappear. She made me promise. And I was a fool, and a coward, and I did it." He took a step closer to the desk, his presence seeming to shrink the cavernous room. "I kept my promise. I stayed away. I waited. And your father sent me a check and a death notice. So don't you dare tell me I don't know him." The truth of his words filled the space between them, undeniable and ugly. This was the part of the story Sarah had left out, the part Caroline had never wanted to examine too closely. "What do you want, Mr. Vance?" she asked, falling back on the transactional language she understood. "Money?" The look he gave her was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. For the first time, she felt small. "My God," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Is that all anything is to you? A transaction? I saw my children yesterday. My son. My son Leo put his hand on my arm. Do you have any idea what that's worth? You could liquidate this entire company, melt down this whole building, and you wouldn't have enough to buy that single moment." He finally sank into the chair, not out of deference, but out of a weariness that seemed bone-deep. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice ragged. "I want my children. I want to know them. I want them to know me." Caroline's mind raced, calculating angles, risks, fallout. Her father's wrath, the stability of the children's lives, the potential for a messy public battle. Every instinct screamed at her to shut this down, to write a bigger check, to have her lawyers bury him. But then she saw Leo's face, his silent, hopeful question hanging in the air. She saw the way Jacob's hand had covered his, a gesture of instinctive, protective love. "One visit," she heard herself say, the words escaping before her rational mind could stop them. "Supervised. At a public park. That's all I can offer for now." Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a fragile, disbelieving hope. "When?" "Saturday. 2 o'clock. I'll send you the address." She stood up, a clear dismissal. "My security will be present." He stood as well, his gaze searching hers. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with a gratitude that made her deeply uncomfortable. He turned and walked out, leaving a faint scent of sawdust and righteous anger in the sterile air. Caroline stood motionless for a long time, the silence of her office pressing in on her. Against all reason, against all logic, she had just opened the door a crack. And she had a terrible, terrifying feeling that a man like Jacob Vance was strong enough to push it all the way open. The courtyard of the Crestwood Academy was a manicured wonderland of perfectly trimmed hedges and imported flagstone. It was a place designed to look good in brochures, not for actual play. Here, even recess felt scheduled. The triplets stood apart from the other children, a small, self-contained island in a sea of boisterous, carefree laughter. They didn't belong. Caroline watched from the window of the headmistress's office, a knot tightening in her stomach. Noah was standing guard, his arms crossed, glaring at a group of boys who had tried to get them to join a game of tag. His posture was a miniature version of the security guards that flanked their penthouse lobby. Mia was sitting on a bench, her nose in a book about marine biology, but her eyes kept darting towards the other kids, a flicker of longing in her otherwise stoic expression. Leo was crouched on the ground, away from everyone, carefully arranging fallen leaves into a complex spiral pattern on the stone. He was building a world of his own because he didn't know how to exist in this one. "They're adjusting beautifully," the headmistress chirped, her voice dripping with the practiced, insincere warmth Caroline despised. "So resilient." Caroline didn't respond. Resilient wasn't the word she would use. They were contained, suppressed. They were learning to perform the role of the Sterling children, just as she had. They were learning to build walls. That evening, the tension in the penthouse was thick. Caroline had just ended a call with her father. "A carpenter?" Arthur Sterling's voice had boomed through the phone, laced with aristocratic disgust. "You're letting a manual laborer, a piece of Sarah's unfortunate past, near my grandchildren. They are his children, father. They are Sterling's. Their mother made her choice. The man has no claim, legal or moral. He abandoned them. He was forced out," Caroline had countered, her voice shaking slightly. "Semantics. He is a threat, Caroline. A threat to the narrative, to the estate, to the stability I have worked so hard to provide. He will want money. It's what his kind always wants. You will cut him off. Is that understood?" "I have agreed to a supervised visit," she'd said, the words feeling like a declaration of war. The silence on the other end of the line had been more menacing than his shouting. "You are making a grave mistake," he'd said, his voice dropping to a cold, silken threat. "Do not let your sentimentality, a trait you thankfully did not inherit from your sister, jeopardize this family's legacy. I will not allow it." He had hung up, leaving Caroline trembling not with fear, but with a cold, unfamiliar rage. Her entire life had been a series of choices made in the shadow of his approval. She had become his perfect heir, the daughter who hadn't disappointed him. And what had it gotten her? An empire of glass and steel, and 3 broken children who looked at her with strangers' eyes. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, She had her driver take her not home, but to the address the PI had found for Jacob Vance. She didn't get out of the car. She just watched from across the street as he worked in his open garage, which served as his workshop. The space was bathed in a warm, golden light. He was planing a piece of wood, his movements fluid and economical, a dance of man and material. There was a deep, quiet focus in his posture, a reverence for the work. This was not just a job to him. It was a calling. He paused, running his hand over the wood. His eyes closed as if he could feel its story. He was covered in a fine layer of sawdust, his face smudged, his t-shirt clinging to his back. By her father's standards, he was nothing. A nobody, a man who worked with his hands. But as she watched him, a craftsman lost in his art, she felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was closer to envy. He was building something real, something tangible and true. She, on the other hand, spent her days in a sterile tower, managing abstractions, her hands touching nothing but keyboards and legal documents. He had a purpose that fit in his hands. Hers was a crushing weight on her shoulders. She was beginning to understand why Sarah had chosen him. He wasn't a threat to the Sterling legacy. He was a threat to the Sterling lie. And that, she was slowly realizing, was a very different thing indeed. The park was a compromise. Neutral ground. Caroline sat on a bench, a sentry in a cashmere coat, flanked by two discreet security guards who were trying to look casual and failing miserably. The triplets stood in a tight cluster a few feet away, watching as Jacob Vance's old Ford truck pulled into the parking lot. He got out holding a simple canvas tote bag. He didn't look at Caroline. His eyes were only for the children. He walked towards them slowly, as if approaching a trio of rare, timid deer. He stopped about 10 feet away, giving them space. "Hi," he said, his voice soft. Mia, ever the spokeswoman, stepped forward. "Hello." Noah remained behind her, his arms crossed, a scowl firmly in place. Leo just watched, his expression unreadable. I wasn't sure what you like to do," Jacob said, gesturing vaguely at the playground. "But I brought some things." He reached into the tote bag. He didn't pull out a video game or an expensive plastic toy. He pulled out 3 small objects and held them on his open palm. They were birds, each one exquisitely carved from a different type of wood, small enough to fit in a child's hand. One was pale maple, another rich cherry, the third dark walnut. Each was unique, the grain of the wood forming a pattern like feathers, the lines fluid and full of life. "I made these for you," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Noah's scowl faltered. Mia's eyes widened with genuine curiosity. Leo took a hesitant step forward. "Why?" Mia asked. "Your mom. She loved birds," Jacob said, a sad smile touching his lips. "She said they were free. I wanted you to have something to remind you of that." He looked directly at Noah. "This one is for you. It's walnut. It's a strong wood. Hard to break." He held out the dark bird. Noah looked from the bird to Jacob's face, his internal conflict visible. After a long moment, he stepped forward and took it, his small fingers closing around the smooth, solid shape. Jacob then looked at Mia. "This one is cherry. See how the lines in the wood are so complex, like a map? I thought you'd like that." He offered her the reddish-brown bird. She took it and immediately began examining it, turning it over and over, her analytical mind captivated. Finally, he looked at Leo. He crouched down to be on the boy's level. "And this one," he said gently, holding out the pale maple bird, "is for you. It's a quiet wood. You have to look closely to see how beautiful it is." Leo looked at the bird, then into Jacob's eyes. He reached out and took it. Then, his fingers still wrapped around the carving, he did something that made Caroline's heart stop. He reached out his other hand and laid it flat on Jacob's chest, right over his heart. Jacob closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the sawdust that seemed to permanently dust his skin. The rest of the hour passed in a dreamlike state. Jacob didn't try to force play. He simply existed with them, He and Noah found a long, sturdy branch and had a mock sword fight that ended in a dramatic, laughing surrender from Jacob. He sat with Mia on the grass and listened with rapt attention as she explained the life cycle of a cicada, asking thoughtful questions that made her light up. With Leo, he didn't speak at all. They walked to the edge of the small pond, and Jacob showed him how to skip stones. Their movements mirrored and silent, a conversation without words. When the hour was up, Caroline stood, her throat tight. "It's time to go." The triplets looked crestfallen. Noah tucked the walnut bird into his pocket as if it were a treasure. Mia was still studying hers. Leo held his tightly in his hand. "Can he come again?" Noah asked, the question aimed at Caroline but his eyes on Jacob. "We'll see," she said noncommittally. Jacob said his goodbyes, his gaze lingering on each of them. As they walked back to the car, Leo, who was walking beside Caroline, slipped his small hand into hers. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact with her since the day his mother died. His hand was warm and clutched inside it. She could feel the smooth, hard shape of the maple bird. That evening, the penthouse felt different. It was still cavernous and sterile, but it was filled with the low murmur of the triplets' voices from their playroom. They were talking about Mr. Jacob. There was a lightness in their tone that hadn't been there before. Later, as Caroline was tucking Mia into bed, her niece looked at her with unnerving clarity. "Aunt Caroline?" "Yes, Mia?" "Was my mommy happy when she was with him?" The question was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the very center of Caroline's guilt. Sarah hadn't been happy for a very long time. Not since a man who smelled of sawdust had been forced to disappear. "Yes, sweetie," Caroline whispered, the truth a painful lump in her throat. She was very happy. After the children were asleep, Caroline had another phone call with her father. It was brief and brutal. "I heard your little field trip was a success," Arthur sneered. "It was a supervised visit, and it went well. Do not mistake my tolerance for approval, Caroline. This ends now. No more visits. You will inform the carpenter that his services are no longer required." "No," Caroline said, the word small but solid. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "They are my responsibility. I will decide what is best for them." She hung up before he could respond, her hand trembling. She walked to the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had just openly defied him for the first time in her adult life. The rebellion was terrifying, and it was intoxicating. Driving away from the park, Caroline had replayed the scene with the carved birds over and over in her mind. It wasn't just a gift. It was a diagnosis. In 1 hour, with 3 small pieces of wood, Jacob Vance had seen into the core of each of her sister's children. He had seen Noah's need for strength, Mia's hunger for complexity, and Leo's quiet beauty. He hadn't just given them a toy. He had given them back a piece of themselves. He had shown them that they were seen, truly seen. It was something she, with all her resources, with all her fierce, protective love, had failed to do. He wasn't just their father. He was their key, and she was the one who had locked the door. The school project was a diorama of a rainforest ecosystem, a classic third-grade assignment. Caroline's first instinct was to solve it the way she solved most problems, with money and delegation. She'd had her assistant source a kit from a high-end educational toy company, complete with pre-molded plastic animals and synthetic foliage. It arrived in a glossy box, promising a perfect, sterile representation of the Amazon. The triplets stared at it with profound indifference. "It looks fake," Mia announced, poking a plastic toucan with her finger. Noah grunted in agreement. Leo had already wandered away to stare out the window. The project was due in 2 days, and for the first time, Caroline felt the stirrings of ordinary parental panic. Her assistant couldn't fix this. Her checkbook was useless. She was staring at a pile of expensive plastic, a symbol of her own inadequacy. Then an idea both reckless and brilliant took hold. She found herself dialing Jacob's number. "I need your help," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. It's a school project. A diorama. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a low, warm chuckle. A diorama? It's not funny. It's due Friday. I'll be there in an hour, he said. He arrived with 2 large boxes, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. He laid out the contents on the vast marble island in the kitchen. Moss, twigs, pieces of bark, dried leaves, smooth river stones, a bag of rich, dark soil. He'd brought the forest to them. Okay, he said, rolling up his sleeves. First rule of the rainforest. It's not neat. He swept the pristine plastic kit into its box and pushed it aside. We build ours from the ground up. For the next 3 hours, Caroline witnessed a miracle. Jacob didn't direct or instruct. He invited. He transformed the kitchen island into a miniature world. He showed Noah how to break twigs to the right length to create the dense underbrush. He gave Mia a small bag of seeds and had her research which ones would represent the canopy and which would be the forest floor. He sat with Leo, and together, with tiny dabs of glue and slivers of bark, they crafted miniature monkeys and sloths, their heads bent together in silent, focused collaboration. Caroline found herself relegated to the role of assistant, dispatched to find scissors or a bowl of water. She watched, mesmerized, as Jacob orchestrated the chaotic, creative energy. He told them stories about the trees the different woods came from. He explained how the moss held water, how the decaying leaves fed the soil. He wasn't just building a diorama. He was teaching them about life, death, and connection, all through the medium of dirt and twigs. The penthouse, usually so silent, was filled with laughter, and the low, rumbling sound of Jacob's voice felt, for the first time, like a home. When they were finished, the diorama was a masterpiece. It was messy, organic, and vibrantly alive. A tiny, perfect world in a cardboard box. It's good, Noah said, a rare and glowing compliment. Mia was beaming. Leo gently placed a final, perfectly formed bark sloth onto a twig branch and looked up at Jacob, his eyes shining. That evening, Caroline did another reckless thing. Stay for dinner, she said. It was an order, not an invitation. He looked surprised, but nodded. Okay, but I'm cooking. The meal they shared was as simple as the diorama's materials. A hearty stew he seemed to conjure from the contents of her sparsely populated refrigerator, and a loaf of crusty bread he'd brought with him. They ate at the kitchen island, the diorama sitting between them like a centerpiece. The conversation was stilted at first, a clumsy dance between their 2 worlds. But the children, emboldened by the day's creative success, filled the silence. Did you build a lot of things with Mommy? Mia asked, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Jacob's smile was sad and soft. All the time, he said. We built the garden where the wildflowers grew. We built a bookshelf for all her books. We were going to build your cradles, but... His voice trailed off. The easy atmosphere faltered. The ghost of Sarah, of all that was lost, settled over them. Caroline felt the old chill return. But then Leo, who had been quiet throughout the meal, slid off his stool. He walked over to Caroline, holding a piece of paper. It was a drawing, done in the vibrant crayons Jacob had also produced from his magic boxes. It was a picture of a house, a simple, boxy house with a smoking chimney. In front of the house stood 5 figures. A tall man with dark hair, a tall woman with blonde hair, and holding their hands, nestled between them, were 3 smaller figures. He had drawn a bright yellow sun over the man, and a silver moon over the woman. He had drawn them all smiling. He had drawn a family, a whole family. Caroline took the drawing, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked from the childish, hopeful crayon marks to Jacob, whose face was a mask of stunned, heartbreaking emotion. This small piece of paper was a truth bomb, a declaration of what the children needed, what they wanted. It was a bridge between 2 worlds, sketched in crayon by a silent, 8-year-old boy. It was everything she had been fighting against, and everything she was starting to realize she wanted. Later that night, long after Jacob had gone and the children were asleep, Caroline sat in her glass-walled office, the city lights a blur of indifferent diamonds. She wasn't looking at market reports or legal briefs. She was staring at the drawing, now taped carefully to the corner of her billion-dollar monitor. The sun and the moon, the man and the woman, the whole unbroken circle of a family. Her carefully constructed world, her father's world, was predicated on the idea that status and security were paramount. But Leo's drawing proposed a different kind of economy, one based not on assets and power, but on a simple, devastating equation: love. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit the truth. Her world wasn't just sterile, it was bankrupt, and she was so lonely. The drawing wasn't an accusation, it was an invitation, and for the first time in her life she wanted to accept. The invitation to his workshop came via text, a simple, "There's something I want to show you." When Caroline arrived, Jacob was waiting at the door of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something old and patient. It was a space that felt like him, practical, strong, and filled with a quiet, creative spirit. Tools hung in neat, orderly rows on the walls. Stacks of lumber were organized by type and size. And in the center of the room, on a sturdy workbench, was a simple, framed photograph. Caroline moved closer. It was a picture of Sarah, younger than Caroline remembered. Her face luminous with a joy so pure it was almost painful to see. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hair a wild halo in the sunlight. Her hand was resting on the arm of the man beside her, a younger, less weary Jacob. They were standing in a field of wildflowers. "That was the day I asked her to marry me," Jacob said, his voice a low murmur beside her. "She said yes." He opened a worn wooden box on the bench. Inside were more photos. Sarah, her belly swollen, asleep on a half-built porch swing. Jacob and Sarah, covered in paint, laughing as they painted a small yellow room. A close-up of their hands, intertwined, hers pale and slender, his calloused and strong. It was a life she had never been privy to, a happiness she had never witnessed. "She was so scared of your father," Jacob said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the photos. "But with me, in our little world, she wasn't. She was brave. She was whole." He finally looked up at Caroline, his eyes dark with a sorrow that felt bottomless. "I know you're their guardian. I know you love them, but for 8 years, I have been a ghost. I see them in my dreams. I talk to them when I'm alone in this workshop. I made a promise to keep them safe, and the only way I could do that was to not exist. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To be a father and to be a ghost." His vulnerability was a physical force, dismantling her defenses piece by piece. The raw, unvarnished truth of his pain made her own carefully managed grief feel shallow and self-indulgent. He wasn't asking for pity. He was simply showing her his wound. And in that moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to show him hers. "It was my fault," she whispered, the confession torn from a place deep inside her she hadn't visited in years. "My relationship with Sarah. It broke because of him. Our father." She sank onto a nearby stool, the scent of sawdust filling her senses. "He pits people against each other. That's how he controls them. He called her the artist and me the asset. He praised my grades, my business sense. And he belittled her art, her sensitivity, her choices, especially you. He made me believe that her life with you was a liability, a threat to the family, to the sterling name." Tears she hadn't shed in a decade pricked at her eyes. "The last time I saw her, before she had the triplets, we had a terrible fight. I told her she was being selfish. I told her she needed to think about her children's future, about the security the family could provide. I told her to give you up. I used his words, his logic. She looked at me. She looked at me like she didn't know who I was anymore. And she was right. I wasn't her sister. I was his soldier." She finally looked at him, letting him see the shame and guilt she had carried for so long. "She chose the family because I helped convince her it was the only safe choice. I broke her heart. I helped him break her heart. And when she died, all I could do was what he taught me. Manage the situation. Secure the assets. The assets were her children. That's all I knew how to do. Jacob listened, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He simply stood there, a silent witness to her confession. When she was finished, the silence in the workshop was heavy with their shared history, their shared love for the woman in the photograph. He reached out not to touch her, but to pick up one of the carved birds from his workbench. He ran his thumb over its smooth head. "She forgave you, Caroline," he said quietly. "She knew you were trapped too." His words were an absolution she had never expected, had never believed she deserved. In that quiet, dusty workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that should have been, a new and fragile connection was being forged between them. They were no longer just the aunt and the father. They were two survivors of Arthur Sterling's cold, transactional world, united by their love for Sarah and her children. They were finally on the same side. Miles away, in an office that was the antithesis of Jacob's workshop, Arthur Sterling sat at the head of a gleaming mahogany table. The room was cold, the air tasting of power and expensive leather. Across from him sat three men in identical dark suits, his personal legal team. They were less lawyers and more weapons, sharpened and aimed at his command. "She's sentimental," Arthur said, his voice laced with contempt. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Her mother's weakness, blooming late. She's allowing this carpenter to poison my grandchildren's minds with his working-class romanticism. We've completed the preliminary background check, Mr. Sterling." The lead lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, said, sliding a thin folder across the table. "Jacob Vance. Financially, he's a non-entity. Small, mortgaged property. A truck with over 200,000 miles on it. His business is solvent but generates a negligible income. He has no significant assets." "Of course he doesn't," Arthur sneered. "Men like him don't build assets. They build dust." "What's his weakness?" "He appears to be clean. No criminal record. No debts aside from his mortgage. His late wife's insurance policy was modest. He's, for all intents and purposes, a model citizen." Arthur slammed his glass down on the table, the sound cracking through the quiet room. "Everyone has a weakness, Marcus. Everyone has a price or a pressure point. I did not hire you for your inability to find one. This man is a threat to my family. He is a ghost who has decided to haunt the living, and I want him exorcised. Permanently." He stood and walked to the window, his back to them. "My daughter, in her infinite wisdom, believes she can integrate this man into our lives. She thinks she can build some sort of blended family. It's a pathetic, middle-class fantasy." He turned back, his eyes like chips of ice. "This is what we will do. You will find something. A building code violation on his workshop. An unpaid tax from 5 years ago. A disgruntled former client. I don't care how small. You will create leverage. But that is secondary. The primary attack will be on his fitness as a parent." Thorne raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds? He has no history." "We will create a history," Arthur said coldly. "He abandoned his children for 8 years. That is the narrative. We will frame it as a selfish, callous act of desertion. We will contrast his financial instability with the unparalleled resources the Sterling family provides. We will file a petition, not just to terminate any potential parental claim he might have, but for me to assume full legal guardianship of the children myself." The lawyers exchanged a brief, subtle glance. This was aggressive. This was scorched earth. "You mean, against your own daughter?" Thorne asked carefully. Arthur's smile was chilling. "Caroline is compromised. Her judgment is clouded by emotion. She is proving herself to be an unfit guardian by exposing the children to this unstable element. We will make that argument in court. She will be forced to choose the carpenter or her children and her position in this family. And I assure you, when faced with that choice, she will fall in line. She always does." He sat back down, the picture of entitled certainty. He was a man who had never lost because he believed it was his birthright to win. He saw the world as a chessboard, and people, including his own children, as pawns to be moved and sacrificed for the preservation of his legacy. Jacob Vance was a minor, inconvenient piece, and Arthur Sterling was about to sweep him from the board. The rapid cascade began on a Tuesday. It didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, menacing whisper of expensive paper. A courier, impassive and professional, delivered the envelope to Caroline at her office. It was thick, heavy, and bore the letterhead of her father's law firm. She slid it open with a silver letter opener, her hand steady. Inside, the legal jargon was a cold, suffocating fog, but the meaning was brutally clear. Petition for guardianship. Arthur Sterling, petitioner. In re, Leo Sterling, Mia Sterling, and Noah Sterling, minors. It went on for pages, a meticulously crafted narrative of lies and distortions. It painted Jacob as a transient and opportunistic biological father who had callously abandoned his offspring for financial gain. It cited his unstable and meager income as a direct threat to the children's welfare. But the most brutal part, the part that made the air leave her lungs, was the section on her. It accused her, Caroline Sterling, of being an unfit guardian, of demonstrating grossly negligent judgment, by knowingly and repeatedly exposing the minors to a potentially dangerous and destabilizing individual. It claimed she was emotionally compromised and incapable of acting in the children's best interests. It was an official declaration of war. Her father was trying to take the children from her. The room, once her fortress of power, suddenly felt like a cage. The city view mocked her. She could control markets, shape industries, but she couldn't stop this. This was a battle on her father's turf, played by his rules. He was using her love for the children, her burgeoning connection with Jacob, as a weapon against her. He was forcing her to choose, just as he had forced Sarah. That evening, the tension in the penthouse was a palpable, living entity. The children felt it. They were quiet, watchful. Caroline was on the phone with the first of many lawyers, her voice tight and strained. He's claiming what? On what grounds? It's baseless. It's a power play. She was pacing, the legal document clutched in her hand, her back to the living room. She didn't see Noah slip out of the playroom. He stood in the doorway, his small body rigid, his face pale. He was listening. This is my father, you don't understand. He will burn everything to the ground to get what he wants. Noah's face crumpled. He turned and ran back to the playroom, where Mia and Leo looked up in alarm. He's going to send him away, Noah whispered, his voice choked with a child's absolute terror. The mean man. He's going to send Mr. Jacob away again. Later, when Jacob arrived, she had called him the moment she'd hung up with the lawyer. The children clung to him. It was Noah, her fierce, angry Noah, who voiced their shared fear. He wrapped his arms around Jacob's legs, his face buried in his jeans. "Are you going away again?" he asked, his voice muffled. "Is the mean man sending you away?" Jacob knelt, his face a mask of confusion and pain. He looked at Caroline over Noah's head, a question in his eyes. She just shook her head, her expression grim, holding up the legal document. He pulled Noah into a tight hug, his jaw clenched. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it seemed to shake the room. "No, I am not going anywhere. I promise." The confrontation with her father took place the next day, in his mahogany and leather inner sanctum. He didn't rise when she entered. He simply gestured to the chair opposite his desk, the same one Jacob had sat in at her office. Felt like a lifetime ago. "Caroline," he began, his voice deceptively calm. "I am doing this for your own good, for the good of the family. You filed a petition to take my sister's children away from me," she said, her voice trembling with a rage so pure it burned. "You called me an unfit mother. You have proven yourself to be unfit," he stated, his voice flat. "Your judgment is clouded. This carpenter has manipulated you, played on your emotions. His name is Jacob Vance," she shot back, "and he is their father, a father you stole from them." "I saved them from a life of mediocrity," Arthur said, his voice rising. "I gave them a legacy, and I will not stand by and watch you squander it because of some pathetic, sentimental fantasy. This is the choice, Caroline. It is very simple. End this association. Cut him out of your life, out of their lives, completely and forever. Publicly renounce him. If you do that, I will withdraw the petition. We can go back to how things were. And if I don't? His eyes were cold, devoid of any familial warmth. Then I will see you in court, and I will win. I will take the children, and I will remove you from the board of Sterling Enterprises. You will have nothing. No family, no career. You will be as much of a disappointment as your sister was. The choice is yours. The ultimatum hung in the air, brutal and absolute. He believed he had her cornered. He believed that, when faced with the loss of everything she had worked for, she would fold. He was counting on the daughter he had raised, the asset he had cultivated. Caroline stood up, her body trembling but her spine ramrod straight. She looked at the man who had shaped her, manipulated her, and starved her of love her entire life, and she felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. She walked out of the office without another word. As she drove away from the towering skyscraper that bore their family name, the city lights blurring through her tears, she wasn't crying out of fear or sadness. She was crying out of a furious, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of freedom. He had laid down his ultimatum, expecting her to break. He didn't realize he had just handed her a sword. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The slow river of her life had just hit the rapids, and she wasn't going to be swept away. She was going to steer. The rain fell in relentless sheets, mirroring the turmoil in Caroline's heart. She didn't drive to the penthouse. She drove to the one place that felt real, the one place that smelled of truth and patience. She pulled up to Jacob's workshop, the headlights cutting through the downpour. He must have heard the car, because the garage door rolled open, spilling warm, golden light into the wet darkness. He stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, waiting. She got out of the car, not bothering with an umbrella, and walked towards him, the cold rain plastering her silk blouse to her skin. She didn't stop until she was standing in front of him, dripping on his concrete floor. "He gave me an ultimatum," she said, her voice shaking. "Me or him. The company, the children, everything." Jacob's face was grim. He reached out and gently brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. "What did you say?" She looked up at him, into his dark, steady eyes, and gave him the answer that had been solidifying in her soul since she walked out of her father's office. "I didn't have to say anything." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "He thinks he can burn my world down. He doesn't realize I'm ready to light the match." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "He's coming for you. He's coming for me. He's coming for them. He thinks he can isolate us, pick us off one by one. He's wrong." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, sleek object. An access card. A key to her building, to the penthouse, to her life. She pressed it into his hand. "You are not a visitor anymore. You are not a secret. You are their father." She finally met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen there before. "You will not fight him alone. You have me." The words hung in the air. A vow, a declaration of alliance. It was more intimate than a kiss, more binding than a contract. It was the total surrender of her carefully guarded independence. Jacob stared at the key card in his palm, then back at her face, his expression one of awe. He closed his fingers around the card, his grip tight. "Caroline," he started, his voice thick. "We need a lawyer." She cut him off, her mind already shifting into strategic mode. "Not one of my father's corporate sharks. Someone different. Someone who fights for people, not for power." She was already pulling out her phone. "I know who to call." The next day, the mood in the penthouse had shifted. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was being pushed back by a new sense of purpose. In the playroom, Caroline found the triplets huddled over a large piece of construction paper. "What's this?" she asked. Mia, the designated scribe, pointed to the top of the page. In her neatest printing, she had written, "The Book of Family Rules." "It's our rules," Noah said, puffing out his chest. Caroline leaned closer to read the first and only rule they had written so far. 1. We stick together. Her throat tightened. They had heard the battle lines being drawn, and they had chosen their side. They were no longer just victims of circumstance. They were soldiers in this new, small army. Their strategy session took place not in a boardroom, but around the kitchen island where they had built the diorama. Elena Ramirez, the lawyer Caroline had called, was the polar opposite of Arthur's legal team. She was sharp, energetic, with eyes that missed nothing. She specialized in family law, specifically cases where wealth and power were used as weapons against children. "Arthur Sterling," Elena said, tapping her pen on a legal pad. "I know his type. He'll try to bury you in motions, bleed you dry, and paint Jacob as a gold-digging deadbeat and Caroline as an unstable heiress. He'll use the truth as the foundation for his lies." Yes, Jacob was absent. "Yes, Caroline, your life is unconventional for a guardian. So what do we do?" Jacob asked, his voice tense. "We don't fight him on his terms," Elena said, her eyes flashing. "His case is about money, power, and legacy. Ours is about love, connection, and the well-being of 3 children. We don't sling mud. We tell your story. The true story." She looked at Jacob. The story of a man who made an impossible promise to the woman he loved. A man who respected her wishes even when it broke his own heart. Then she looked at Caroline. The story of a woman who is breaking free from a lifetime of emotional tyranny to do what's right for her sister's children. She smiled. "His narrative is cold and transactional. Ours is human. In family court, the human story, if told honestly, almost always wins." She gathered her papers. "He wants to make this about the Sterling name. We will make it about Leo, Mia, and Noah." After she left, a heavy silence settled over the kitchen. The fight ahead of them was daunting, the outcome uncertain. Caroline walked over to the window, looking out at the city that had once been her kingdom and now felt like a battlefield. Jacob came to stand beside her. "Are you scared?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," she admitted. "He's never lost. He's never fought us," Jacob said simply. "Not like this. Not together." Later that night, Jacob let himself into his own house, the silence a stark contrast to the nascent warmth of the penthouse. He walked into his workshop, the key card Caroline had given him feeling heavy and significant in his pocket. He looked around at the half-finished projects, the scent of wood, the quiet testament to his solitary life. For years, this space had been his sanctuary, his refuge from a world that had taken everything from him. But now it felt different, felt like a starting point, not an ending. He thought of Caroline, her fierce, unexpected strength, the way she had looked at him when she'd said, "You have me." He had spent so long being a ghost, a man defined by loss. But Caroline and the children were pulling him back into the light, demanding that he be solid, that he be present, that he fight. He was in awe of her courage, the way she was willing to dismantle her entire life for the sake of what was right. And he was terrified for her, for the children, and for this fragile, impossible hope that was beginning to bloom in the barren landscape of his heart. The battle was coming. He didn't know if they would win, but for the first time in a very long time he wasn't alone. The courtroom was a sterile, wood-paneled box, cold and impersonal. It felt like another of Arthur Sterling's boardrooms. He sat at the opposing table, flanked by his team of sharks, looking regal and utterly confident. He was in his element. Caroline sat beside Jacob and Elena, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. The morning was a brutal, systematic assault. Marcus Thorne, Arthur's lead counsel, was brilliant and merciless. He painted Jacob's absence as a simple, damning fact. For 8 years, Mr. Vance, while the Sterling family provided for these children, clothed them, housed them, educated them at the finest institutions, where were you? You were, by your own admission, less than 50 miles away. Did you send a birthday card? A Christmas gift? Did you once attempt to contact the children you claim to love? No, Jacob said, his voice quiet but steady. I made a promise to their mother. A convenient promise, wouldn't you say?